Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and dear friends, it is my pleasure, my true pleasure, to be with you here today to moderate this panel discussion from the sidelines to the frontlines, advancing women, peace and security agenda in Africa during the pandemic and beyond. This session aims at zooming into and taking a closer look at how the pandemic has affected women and girls in conflict settings, how the pandemic has influenced our work on the WPS agenda, and to assess collectively the emerging opportunities to further strengthen women's meaningful participation as we strive to build back better. Now, let me start by introducing the esteemed colleagues that are with us here today as panelists, because we're truly lucky to have such a diverse group of panelists, all with in-depth expertise and lengthy experience in the subject matter. Ms. Bineta Diop, Special Envoy of the AUC Chairperson for Women, Peace and Security from the African Union Commission. Dr. Maya Morsi, President of the National Council of Women of the Arab Republic of Egypt. And as I understand, Ms. Morsi is connecting from the Aswan Forum space in Cairo. And Ms. Mavich Cabrera Beleza, CEO and founder of the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, as well as Mr. Esther Dassanou, coordinator of the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa of the African Development Bank. I sincerely welcome you all to this session. Ladies and gentlemen, since the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action in 1995, certain gains have indeed been made, and they are worth celebrating. Mainly in areas such as education and such as health, there has been significant advances, and of course in other areas as well. But these gains, while incredibly encouraging, haven't moved in the speed that would allow neither you or myself, or even our children, to live in a world characterized by true gender equality. In the Global Gender Gap Report from 2019, it actually said that we all have around 100 years to go to really and truly witness a world characterized by gender equality. So even before COVID-19, we had a long way to go. And then came the pandemic. And it hit everyone, girls, boys, women, and men. And being myself someone who have worked decades in conflict settings, war zones, famines, I can assure that the more acute a crisis is, the more it strikes hard and brutal, indiscriminately, at everything and everyone that comes in its way, regardless of gender. But after a couple of weeks following that very first COVID-19 case that was detected around 1 year ago, a more sophisticated analysis on the impact of COVID-19 could be done. And already here, we saw signals that quickly emerged as hard evidence on how the pandemic affected women and girls in specific ways. The negative impact on women and girls are noted in many areas, but significantly, as we all know, in the area of violence against women, which has spiked, but also in the area of economic empowerment and women's employment, as a unproportionate large number of women have lost their jobs. And the figures that we have ahead of us are alarming indeed. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why UN Women, UNDP, and a number of national actors across the region have come together in the Global Gender Response Tracker, in which a number of excellent initiatives have already been documented. But similarly, my friends, in the area of peace and security, we see signs of regression. And here again, similarly to COVID-19, prior to the pandemic, there were immense gaps in the implementation of the United Nations Security Council 1325. only 11% of ceasefire agreements included gender provisions. And here, my dear colleagues and dear friends, here is an equation that I, for one, can't wrap my head around. Because evidence tells us that if a peace agreement is inclusive in nature and it includes women, it is more likely to prevail. Peace is more lasting. But evidence also tells us that women in decision-making processes, including political ones, are more prone to work across party lines, across religions, across beliefs, across ideologies. And in our world today, so determined by fragility, volatility, and polarization, I wonder, what merit can be more important than this? The ability to reach out across lines. But of course, in terms of peace and security and COVID-19, the pandemic and gender, it's all intertwined. And it all needs to be addressed in a comprehensive response, or through rather a comprehensive response. And here is where the National Action Plans on Women, Peace and Security comes in handy. It is interesting because last year, UN Women conducted an analysis on 6 national action plans in the region of Arab states. And we found that more than 60% of actions that are outlined in those plans are the very actions that have been advised and recommended for the COVID-19 response. It again gives you that picture of interconnectedness. So in a way, we have the vehicle, we have the tool, and it needs, of course, to be financed and implemented. And as we are virtually, at least, in beautiful Aswan today, let me also take the opportunity to applaud Egypt's decision made by the President of Egypt to develop Egypt's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which will adopt it in 2021. Now, the importance of Egypt adopting the National Action Plan as chair of the UN Peacebuilding Commission and a strong contributor to peacebuilding and peacekeeping missions worldwide is, of course, significant. And equally, networks such as FemWise-Africa or the Arab Women Mediators Network are critical in ensuring that women are at the center of mediation and conflict prevention efforts. All these platforms, my friends, will become even more pertinent in the post-COVID-19 recovery, when economic and social tensions might rise. And also, they will become more important and critical tools as we aspire to realize the Agenda 2063 for Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, it is indeed an honor for me to moderate this panel today and to hear from our distinguished experts on how to promote a recovery that is both inclusive of women leadership and that ensures that gender equality is financed and achieved. Without further ado, I would like to now turn to our very dear panelists. And I will address each of our panelists with a specific question related to your area of expertise. And following, we will also have an open floor discussion for around 15 minutes to allow for questions and also for a mutual discussion. And at the very end, I will conclude in maximum 1 or 2 minutes. So let me start with Ms. Bineta Diop. I don't know if you can hear me, Ms. Diop.
Yeah. Yes, I unmute. Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. So Your Excellency took part in the first edition of the Aswan Forum and emphasized the need to address structural barriers that hinders African women from realizing their full potential as key players in sustaining peace in Africa. And furthermore, Your Excellency's office had several initiatives, such as the #SheLeadsPeace campaign, with the aim of accelerating actions for peace in Africa and promoting, of course, the role of women and girls in conflict prevention, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction. So in your views, Your Excellency, how can these initiatives go hand in hand with the continental efforts to mitigate the disproportionate effects of the pandemic on women and girls in armed situations. And of course, how to accelerate the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security in Africa.
Thank you so much, Susan, Madam Moderator. First of all, let me start by standing on the existing protocol. And let me again, permit me to thank the ASWAN Forum, the organizing committee. You know, last year we were so privileged to be in ASWAN, and now COVID have isolated each one of us. But I'm very glad to participate and thank the organizer for creating such a space. And we continue to discuss gender equality, women's empowerment, and in particular, women, peace and security. So I think all of us in the women, peace and security community were in high gears in 2020 to mark the 20th anniversary of the 1325 resolution, the landmark resolution. And then COVID-19 erupted with its corollary of disruption of all laid down plans. From a health crisis, the pandemic turned very quickly into a much broader societal threat and an immense security threat for women and girls. Indeed, across the world and in Africa, there was widespread increase in the violence against women and girls to the extent of being called a shadow pandemic by UN Women. As the majority of the workforce in health sector, evidence have shown that women that were immediately at the front of battling the crisis were at high risk of infection and death. Furthermore, women who constitute the majority, those who are in informal sector, in the informal economy, were also left, as you have said, Madam Moderator, with no incomes to cater for themselves, their family, and community. So we could see that women in refugee camps have difficulties to respect the preventive measure as was established by CDC, such as social distancing. So despite this adverse situation, women and women-led organizations at all levels mobilized to respond to this invisible enemy. In Africa, I can give you a few examples. The first example, this mobilization was that in 7 May 2020, African women foreign ministers convened a virtual meeting to deliberate on Africa's response to the COVID-19. And indeed, they were saluting the rapid and coordinated Africa response, COVID-19, under the leadership of Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, who was then the chair of the African Union, chairperson of the AU, but also with the leadership of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the then outgoing chair of the African Union, and many African leaders who have been at the forefront and put adequate resources to respond to COVID-19. So there was a recognition and by the women ministers of foreign affairs to strengthen the role and leadership of women in the response of the pandemic. Secondly, the African women ministers in charge of gender, and I recognize my sister, Dr. Maya Morsi, they get together to work on AU guidelines on gender responsive response to COVID-19. The guideline known as the framework document on the impact of COVID on gender equality and women's empowerment have been adopted at the highest level of the African Union, which will help the AU member states to adopt a gender lens to when we respond at the country level to COVID-19. As part of it, it was agreed that the gender component is incorporated into the special fund established for the COVID-19 response. But again, civil society organizations such as the Africa Women Leaders Network, the Gender is My Agenda Campaign Network, all of them get together, mobilize, and highlight and share experience on the action undertaken to respond to COVID-19 with the view of spreading their efforts. For example, the distribution of masks, of all necessary equipment in the field to complement what our member states, our government have been doing. So being the one exposed at the community, and I like what you said, women being at the front line, not at the sideline. And that's what women have been doing in Africa. But we have also to recognize that in my office, as you mentioned, we launched the She Lead Peace campaign and organized the first Africa Women Forum to bring all stakeholders from government, from civil society, women refugee, women in peacekeeping, such as in our AMISOM. The youth as well have played an important role, and they share experience. Of course, we learn from the consequences of COVID and impact on the population, but also share experience and solidarity action that have been taken on the ground to respond to the pandemic. So you see that African women have been at the forefront to respond to COVID-19. A major lesson from the pandemic that we need to learn is that there is an imperative that to define solutions that are anchored in human security. We saw the loss of the education, the system, our children, the schools were closed, the health system were affected. So we need to have that holistic approach and address immediate and structural causes of the pandemic. In this perspective, during the Africa Women Forum for Peace and Security, which will be an annual forum, we assess the action plan, because right now, member states, we have 30 member states that have adopted a national action plan on WPS, 30. It's more than a half of our continent. And we have 20 countries that have reported following the continental result framework, have reported on the implementation. Because what we need now is action, action, action. And certainly, right now in the framework, we have included the issue indicators regarding new threats, such as climate change, which will affect us as well, but COVID-19. We need to measure in the post-COVID-19, the implementation of a measure that have been adopted by our member states. So to conclude, let me just give a few examples, stretching few elements on how do we transform in our community and guarantee that we build back better. First, we need to continue to advocate. And I think that's why we are together in Aswan, talking about why women should be at the forefront. We need to be together to advocate. And now, even though now, for the inclusion of women through every strata of decision-making in our society, women leadership matter. It was being demonstrated that when women have taken the leadership, I think they manage well than others did manage well. And also wise men who are gender sensitive, the he for she, they management because they care about the community first. And I think that's where we need women leadership at the front to manage well such a pandemic and look into inclusive society and look into the, the potential of the society to impact and to participate meaningfully. Second, our system and structure need to recognize the existing barriers and seek to address this. I name them when it comes to the system, education system, when it comes to our health system, when it comes to many other that is existing, even when we access to economic, when it comes to land and others, we need to look at those barriers and make sure that we remove them and put women at the front. Let me also say that the third one, we need to provide justice and psychosocial support for women who have had to go through difficult time, including abuse through this time. We need to not just build trust, but provide safety and security for women. I stop there, and I want to thank you again for your invitation. I'm available if there are questions after the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Excellency, for those invaluable insights. And I am sure that there are questions and reflections, and we will come back to those at the end of the session.
Thank you.
And now I wish to turn to Dr. Maya Morsi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Susan.
Excellent. Hello. And my question to you, Dr. Morsi, is the following. Now, the adverse repercussions of the pandemic on women and girls is a global wake-up call, stressing the need to adopt gender-inclusive policies and establish response mechanisms that cater to both men and women. Now, Egypt has been at the forefront of gender-responsive measures during the pandemic, having taken initiatives such as the development of the Rapid Response Policy and the issuance of the Women Policy Tracker, both of which guide national efforts to address women's needs during crises. Now, Dr. Morsi, building on the outcomes and insights of these initiatives, in your Excellency's view, what are the key good practices that can be shared for strengthening gender-responsive governance that take into account the differentiated needs of women in national planning and responses?
شكرا سوزان وتحية كبيرة لصديقة بنيتوب وشكرا على لهذه الجلسة سوزان. منذ عقود طويلة لم يشهد العالم أزمة خطيرة مثل تفشي جائحة، وأثرت الجائحة على الجوانب الصحية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية في كافة دول العالم، سواء كانت ونزاع مسلح. ولكي نستقبل وتعافٍ سريع يتعامل مع الجائحة وتدعي الاستفادة من قدرات وتجارب النساء في التعامل مع الأزمات. ونحيي المرأة بالدول الإفريقية تمتلك خبرات عديدة ما أثبتت جدارة مذهلة في مواجهة الأزمات. حققت مصر إيجابيا ملحوظا في مجال دعم وتمكين المرأة والمساواة بين الجنسين على الصعيد الوطني الدولي 6 سنوات الأخيرة، ويرجع ذلك إلى السياسية الداعمة والمساواة وترجمة حقوقها الدستورية إلى قوانين تقوم بها جهات حكومية. انتشار جائحة كوفيد-19 الدور الهام التي تلعبه المرأة على جميع الأصعدة. وفور تفشي الجائحة في مصر في مارس 2020 بدأ المجلس القومي للمرأة مع الحكومة المصرية بدراسة دور المرأة المصرية في ظل هذه الأزمة وما هو تأثير. وأصدرت الحكومة والمجلس القومي للمرأة ورقة برامج وسياسات بشأن خطة الاستجابة السريعة لمصر لفيروس كوفيد-19 لكافة الجهات المعنية بالدولة لمعرفة دور المرأة وتأثير هذا على التدابير والسياسات اتخاذها لحماية المرأة. بها 4 مكونات أساسية. المحور المكون الإنساني، الصحة، التعليم والحماية الاجتماعية والدعم النفسي. ومن خلال برامج الدعم بالفعل فيما يتعلق بجميع الجوانب الصحية النفسية والجسدية والعقلية، خدمات الرعاية الصحية الإنجابية وبرامج الاجتماعية، وخاصة تدابير المرأة المسنة والمرأة ذات الإعاقة والحامل والمرأة، وكذلك في مجال التعليم لمواجهة تداعيات قرارات غلق المدارس في هذه الفترة ما قد يتسببه ذلك من تسرب الفتيات من التعليم. الثاني جاء خاص بالمرأة واتخاذ القرارات والقيادة والحماية من العنف، حيث أن إدماج النساء في مجالات صنع واتخاذ القرار يمكن أن يحسن آليات الأمن الصحي والكشف والوقاية الصحية، والتأكد من قدرة المرأة على الحصول على معلومات ذات الصلة، كذلك وضع تدابير الاستجابة وتوفير الدعم والاجتماعي والقانوني والاستشاري للمرأة يمكن العنف الناتج عن تداعيات الظروف الاجتماعية المتولدة من القرارات الاحترازية لمواجهة الفيروس. المحور كانت تركيزه على الفرص الاقتصادية، وتعتمد تدخلات الاستجابة المقترحة على الآليات الموجودة بالفعل أو تدشين آليات جديدة لدعم العاملات التي تأثرت بسبل عيشهن أو شهدوا انخفاض دخل أو أعمال حرة، ومع اقتراح حلول بديلة جهة التراجع الاقتصادي وتأثير ذلك على المرأة العاملة سواء في القطاع الرسمي أو الغير رسمي. المحور الرابع جاء مختص بالبيانات والمعرفة، حيث أن تدخلات الاستجابة في تجميع البيانات المصنفة الجنس والعمر والإعاقة المتعلقة بانتشار الفيروس، بما في ذلك تتبع الاستجابة الطارئة ودعم أبحاث السياسات والابتكار الاجتماعي ورصد وتقييم تأثير الفيروس وإجراء استطلاعات الرأي العام من أجل فهم الاختلاف في التعرض والعلاج والمساعدة في تصميم التدابير الواقعة وفقا لذلك. وجاء إطلاق المجلس القومي للمرأة لمرصد للسياسات والبرامج المستجيبة لاحتياجات المرأة خلال جائحة فيروس كورونا المستجد كآلية رصد ومتابعة تنفيذ تلك السياسات في مارس 2020، وتم رصد 162 تدبير وقرار وإجراء وقائي للمرأة المصرية خلال الفترة من مارس 2020 إلى يناير 2021. وبذلك احتلت مصر المركز الأول في التقرير الصادر عن هيئة الأمم المتحدة وبرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي حول الإجراءات التي اتخذتها الدول حول العالم لمساندة المرأة خلال جائحة كوفيد-19، والذي أوضح بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وغرب آسيا أن عدد الإجراءات التي اتخذتها مصر للمرأة وفقا للرصد لهيئة الأمم المتحدة هو أعلى عدد من التدابير التي تم اتخاذها في المنطقة المشار إليها الأزمة. جاءت الإجراءات التي تم اتخاذها الدولة المصرية مختصة بمساندة العمالة الغير منتظمة، تمثيل المجلس القومي في كافة اللجان الوزارية الخاصة بالعمالة الغير منتظمة، الدور الهام التي لعبته المرأة في المواقع القيادية، توسيع الفرص الاقتصادية لتشمل النساء التي في حاجة إلى القروض الصغيرة ومتناهية الصغر، توفير الدعم الاقتصادي للمقدمي الرعاية الصحية من النساء الأطباء والمهنيين، الخطة التنفيذية للإجراءات مستهدف تطبيقها ضمن محفز سد الفجوة بين الجنسين، والتي تطرح الشراكة بين والقطاع الخاص لسد الفجوة وتمكين المرأة. برامج التدريب المالية، استمرار جهود مشروع المواطنة لإصدار بطاقات الرقم، تسهيل الوصول إلى الخدمات الصحية الإنجابية اللازمة للسيدات، وصرف وسائل تنظيم الأسرة، حماية المسنات وذوات الإعاقة، رفع الوعي وتعزيز البيانات والمعرفة لتشمل المستفيدات من النساء، ميزة استثنائية للأمهات والسماح لجميع الأمهات العاملات والأمهات الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة بالقيام بواجباتهن العائلية أطفالهن دون فقدان وظائفهن، إجراءات لحماية مراكز الاستضافة للمرأة من كافة أشكال العنف، تقديم الاحتياجات الأساسية والغذائية بالإضافة للدعم النفسي، وأيضا التركيز على فئات اللاجئات والمهاجرات ضمن البرامج والنظم الصحية، والتركيز على حماية المرأة من كافة أشكال العنف كان عاجل لحمايتها الضعفات الإجراءات الاحترازية. وجاء على المستوى الدولي قادة مصر مبادرة في الأمم المتحدة لطرح قرار أمام الجمعية العامة مع الشقيقتين الجزائر والسعودية بالإضافة إلى الصين وزامبيا بشأن تعزيز الاستجابة الوطنية والدولية السريعة لتأثير آثار كوفيد-19 على النساء والفتيات. وقد نجحت مصر في حشد الدعم والتأييد في إطار الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة لاعتماد هذا القرار غير مسبوق، وذلك بالإجماع وبتوافق الآراء خلال اللجنة الثالثة للجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة المعنية بحقوق الإنسان وبالمسائل الاجتماعية والإنسانية والثقافية. القرار الضوء على الاحتياجات الخاصة للمرأة والفتاة أثناء الجائحة، ويتناول التداعيات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية على حقوق، ويطرح رؤية عملية لكيفية تعزيز التعامل الوطني مع تلك التداعيات. وفي الختام، وعلى الرغم من التأثير السلبي لأزمات مثل أزمة فيروس كورونا على الإنجازات التي تحققت في المساواة بين الجنسين وتمكين المرأة، ولكن من المنظور الإيجابي للجائحة هي وجود إرادة سياسية داعمة ووجود استعداد قوي وبنية تحتية قوية للدولة المصرية مكنتها التعامل مع الجائحة بامتياز. كما سلطت الجائحة الضوء على قدرة الدولة المصرية على توحيد جهود الدولة لأخذ جميع احتياجات المواطنين والمواطنات في الاعتبار، مما أدى إلى الأداء المشرف للدولة المصرية على المستوى الوطني والدولي للتعامل مع الجائحة. وتعتبر مصر خطة عمل المرأة والسلم والأمن التي هي قيد الإعداد فرصة لمعالجة قضايا واحتياجات النساء في الجائحة، وحيث تتمتع مصر الآن من خلال هذه التجربة التي عرضتها اليوم التعامل مع الوباء وأثناء الانتشار، والتي يمكن أن نشاركها مع الدول الأخرى. ونتمنى العام القادم أن تشارك في أسوان، وأن ينجو العالم من هذا الوباء، وأن ينعم العالم بالأمن والأمان. شكرا سوزان.
شكرا يا دكتورة مرسي, and thank you so much for giving us an insight of the holistic policies that have been taken in Egypt, but more importantly, I would say that were quickly translated to programs on the ground that you so well presented in these less than 10 minutes. So a huge thank you. And again, I'm sure that there are follow-up questions and there will be a discussion at the end of the session. So with no further delay, I will also turn now to Ms. Mavich Cabrera Baleza. And first, just to make sure that you can hear me. Excellent. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Excellent. So my question to you is that African women peacebuilders were on the front lines providing for their communities in an attempt to alleviate the burdens and impacts of the pandemic, including through humanitarian aid, healthcare, and social services. And this, of course, in line with the Global Network for Women Peacebuilders had launched a number of initiatives to take stock of women peacebuilders' efforts during this very crisis. So building on your experiences and particularly, I would say, thinking and reflecting on the change in the international and regional funding priorities. How can we capitalize on lessons learned from the pandemic to support African women peacebuilders? And how can we also bolster their role as positive agents for peace in armed conflicts and in post-conflict settings. Over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the ASWAN Forum for organizing this important conversation. Thank you, Susan, for those thought-provoking questions. One of the persistent obstacles in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is the failure to allocate adequate, sustained, and flexible funding for its implementation. Funding is scarce throughout the different components of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but especially funding for the work of women peace builders, and particularly during this global crisis. The 2020 report of the Secretary General to the Security Council on Women, Peace and Security has pointed out that bilateral aid to women's organizations in fragile or conflict-affected countries has stagnated at 0.2% of total bilateral aid, which is calculated at around 96 million on average per year. But in contrast, military expenditure reached 1.9 trillion in 2019, the largest ever annual increase in the decade. If the contrast between funding for women's work in conflict prevention on peace and peace building and funding for war doesn't bother us, what will? Now, here are some of the lessons learned. The COVID-19 response, particularly from governments, has been gender blind and peace blind. Gender inequalities, women and girls' needs are not taken into account. Neither are the impacts the pandemic has had on conflicts and violence around the world. While vaccines are now available to different segments of populations and still in very limited countries, there's a vaccine inequity, as we know. Violent conflicts remain a deadly reality for at least 2 billion people who live in places impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. Another problem and lesson learned at the same time is that the pandemic disrupts or stops peace processes, and these have specific gendered impacts. Ceasefire agreements have been violated or have expired. Violence has intensified in countries and regions such as Afghanistan, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Yemen, and the Sahel, hampering the delivery of much-needed humanitarian aid. Peace building and the implementation of peace agreements have been deprioritized and defunded in some contexts. But we all know that the pandemic is not an isolated crisis. It has emphasized our interconnectedness. However, there is still a lack of intersectional approach to pandemic response and recovery. Racial and ethnic inequalities, gaps in educational opportunities and income, lack of adequate response to climate change and other environmental crises compound the problems brought about by the pandemic. And corollarily, the pandemic aggravates all of these problems. Now, the question is, how can we bolster the roles of women peace builders as positive agents for peace? We need to increase the funding to make it flexible and predictable, and provide core funding to support the institutional strengthening of women's rights organizations, not just their projects. After all, peace is not a project. It must be a part of our global culture and day-to-day existence. And I should also point out that during the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 in October, the Secretary General, in his report to the Security Council, presented 5 global goals on this agenda for the next decade. And one of them is to increase the official development aid by 5 times for women's rights organizations. Another important point is the need to reduce military spending, particularly weapon spending. This pandemic, despite all of the negative impacts, including the disruption of peace processes, the pandemic is a teachable moment. It must be a moment of reflection that instead of investing in war, government should be investing in peace. Guns do not make us safe. Efficient healthcare, quality and gender-sensitive education that is accessible to all people, equal economic opportunities are some of the drivers of inclusive and sustainable peace. And I will point out that the global goals presented by the Secretary General includes a call for the reduction of excessive military expenditures. Another important point that I would like to emphasize is a need for protection of women peace builders and human rights defenders. Many women peace builders and human rights activists, including their families, are subjected to harassments, threats, and harm because of their work in implementing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, because of their work in promoting women's rights and gender equality. This too is one of the global goals highlighted by the Secretary General, and he calls on member states to guarantee the security of women peace builders and human rights defenders. Another important point is to create enabling conditions for women's meaningful participation in peace and security and political processes, including elections. This also requires support for women to be in decision-making in task forces on the response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we say women, we would like to emphasize women of all ages, including especially young women. Youth have a lot to contribute in the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, as well as in the response and recovery from the pandemic. However, young people, especially young women, are often excluded from policy and decision-making. We also need to guarantee the synergy between the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and the Youth, Peace, and Security agenda. And interestingly, the theme of this year's International Women's Day is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. The theme celebrates the tremendous efforts by women and girls around the world in shaping a more equal future, including equitable recovery from the pandemic. And to echo Secretary General Guterres, the COVID-19 response has highlighted the power of women's leadership. The world needs women at the decision-making table in order to build back better and equal. And finally, I also want to point out that there is a digital divide. As we increasingly become dependent on digital technologies, it has become clear that the access to digital technologies is not equal for all people, and especially there is also a gender gap between that digital divide. UNESCO has pointed out that in conflict-affected countries and fragile states, access to online technologies, access to internet is only at 19% of the population. Access to the digital technologies has become clear that it can be a lifesaver, and at the same time, it guarantees our participation in discussions like this, in discussions on how to advance the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So I call on member states to work with telecommunication companies to ensure safe, secure, and equitable access to the technologies. And during this crisis, internet companies and video conferencing companies are raking in huge profits. The least they can do is to ensure people's access to health-related information, ensure cyber security for all, and close the digital divide. I'll stop here and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for this intervention. And you were alluding to my thought-provoking questions. And I would have to say that these are also equally thought-provoking ideas and reflections. Very interesting. Follow your thoughts here. And again, I'm sure that there will be a number of questions at the end of this session. Thank you so much for your invaluable insight. And now, our last panelist, I would turn to Ms. Esther Dassanou, also to make sure that you are with us and that you can hear us.
I am with you and I can hear you.
Excellent. Now, Ms. Dassanou, one of the key outcomes of the Aswan Forum number 2, basically the preparatory workshops on women, peace and security, was ensuring a robust and integrated efforts that address women's economic vulnerability, including through technology and access to information. In other words, programs that address structural barriers impeding women's economic empowerment and also to support their businesses. Now, given your extensive experience in leveraging women's financial inclusion, how do the AFAWA program target women economic empowerment and promote access to information? And also, how do we unlock young women's potentials as a powerful force for Africa's peace, security, and economic prosperity? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much as well to the ASFAN organization. It's I'm very glad to be here. So very quickly, I think it's really important first and foremost to understand that the peace and security and stability of our continent is also very much reliant on our ability to create jobs and to create jobs for our youth. And within the youth for young women as well. And women, and especially women SMEs on the continent, have a huge role to play in being able to create these jobs. However, to your point, they have to be provided with the access to the financial services, the access to the skills, the access to the information, as well as be able to operate in an enabling environment that enables them to grow and to create these different jobs for our young population and women, in young women as well. And so based on that, the bank has created the Affirmative Finance Action for Women, which seeks precisely to address all these structural barriers that are an impediment to women and to young women also to be able to access both the finances and the skills, but also to access the jobs in a way. So through AFAWA, basically we are able to work with financial institutions on the continent to be able to provide the access to finance that the women-owned SMEs need, and that includes the younger women as well, to be able to grow bankable and sustainable businesses in the long run. We are also able, working with these financial institutions as well, to provide the necessary skills, knowledge, and training that women of all ages in the entrepreneurship market need in order for them to run and to run profitable businesses, but also scalable businesses, because it is through scale that we will be able to create the jobs that the continent so much is in need of. And through that, also work alongside our government colleagues, the different government agencies, including central banks, including ministries of finance, ministries of gender as well, to ensure that the policies that are in place are conducive to providing access to women. And it's interesting the panelist right before me was talking about the fact that there is a digital divide and that, you know, women to a certain degree are left out. But that actually starts with the policy. So if at policy level, everything that has to do with digital financing, for example, is cumbersome, is difficult, it'll be difficult for women to be able to access. And given the mobility, for example, challenges that women face, digital financing is a big solution for that. And so we definitely encourage governments to look at the policies that they're putting in place when it comes to digitalization and digital financing in a very inclusive manner, right? Not to look at it just from a holistic, but really to take into account the impact that these policies will have on women and their ability to access. And it's the same when it comes to information and when it comes to also financial services. If women are not able to access land, and yet the main, if you will, type of collateral that is accepted and expected also to be accepted by financial institutions is land, we're inadvertently pushing women out, and in the same process, you know, closing the door for young women who are even less likely right away to access. And so through the program, our goal is really to touch on these three pillars to ensure that women entrepreneurs are able not only to access the different, basically the different tools that they need, be it access to finance, access to skills, and access to the right policies in order for them to grow strong and scalable businesses that will then create jobs for our youth population, both men and women, but also start building, if you will, the entrepreneurs of the entrepreneurs of tomorrow through these young women entrepreneurs that we're also, if you will, guiding through the process. So let me stop here and turn it back over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much once again for very practical, tangible examples that I'm sure we will take with us now when we turn to the open discussion. Again, a very, very helpful presentation. And I have to say that I appreciate the concreteness and the tangibility of the language that we've had throughout the session so far. So thank you so much. Let us now see, I think we have not more than, let's say altogether, 15 minutes for questions, reflections, and also a mutual discussion. And I know that I will have some help in terms of moderating this. We see colleagues of mine that are now highlighting some of the key questions. All right, so I will start with this one, and it's actually open for all panelists. And it follows. The pandemic has made it difficult for women in conflict situations. But how can we build on the visibility, critical issues, and inequalities this pandemic has spotlighted when it comes to the 20th anniversary of the UN SCR 1325 and post-pandemic? So the question is essence, as we alluded to earlier, that the pandemic has definitely exposed a number of areas that we from the very early beginning knew were critical in terms of gender equality and the women, peace and security agenda. So how can we use that visibility that has come from the pandemic to work in different ways? And again, this is for all panelists.
Susan, if I may.
Please.
So I think it's important that we address the questions at the root causes. And one of the things that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic in regards to entrepreneurship is that basically businesses were closing very quickly. There was a need to have packages to enable them to survive the pandemic. There were no sales, etc., etc. So the bank pretty much got into emergency funding mode. And in our emergency packages, we had carve-outs for women-owned SMEs. The only thing is, when we started rolling out these programs for the women SMEs, they were nowhere to be found. Why? Because all of them were operating, or a large part of them, unfortunately, were operating in the informal sector. So it meant all of a sudden that we had gotten comfortable with informality, while in the end, it's actually not helping in both the process of rebuilding, but also in the process of ensuring that we could help and assist the women SMEs. All that to say that I think what the pandemic has zoomed in on is the fact that we cannot keep leaving women in the informal sector and acting, if you will, as if this is just the modus operandi, that's how they are, and it's okay. It's not okay. We need women SMEs, women entrepreneurs to come out of the informal sector, to register their businesses, to run their businesses in a more formalized manner, because it has an impact both on their ability to access financing, but even on their ability to access assistance in the long run.
Maybe just a follow-up question from my end, because I think your answer were very, very interesting. So what you're alluding to is that transition, in a sense, from the informal sector to the formal sector. So and in the previous presentation, you alluded to some of the key barriers to those. But if you would point out the top 2 key barriers for women in terms of making that transition, what would those be?
So, I mean, I think, and we're in the process, if you will, at the bank of digging a lot further into that, I have to say. But what we're seeing right now is there is, of course, the perception of taxes and the taxes being really high. So, you know, I think the basically enterprises that are in the informal sector have a tendency to run away from that, which then requires the need for, you know, entities both at government level as well as development organization institutions level to perhaps think about a different model or a different solution to enable these enterprises to pay their taxes, but perhaps it's a different tax regime. It's a different, you know, tax system that fits better with the realities that this particular segment of the market, of the population faces. The other bit also, I think, has to do with the education level. If everything that we're doing and the way in which we're providing the information is in a way and in a language that the population does not particularly understand or comprehend, then here again, it's an impediment to them registering. So I think there's a bit of effort that needs to be made when it comes to education, educating women who are within the informal sector, first in a language that they understand, but the language doesn't always mean it's the dialect or not the dialect. It's even in the terms that, you know, we use that are so technical that perhaps most people also don't understand.
Thank you so much.
Let me just,
yes,
Susan, this is
please.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think one of the, when it comes to the point of view of the African Union, we know that we have a lot of policies. 1325 is embedded in many of our instruments in the continent. As I mentioned before, we have 30 countries that have a national action plan, but really is, again, the implementation. And when we talk about implementation, is how do we put in place mechanism for accountability? We tend to think that, we adopt our plan and other will come and implement it for us. We should be leading the process, I think. And as my sister from AFDB have said, there are solutions, even that it's fragmented. We need to look at the solutions that are there and make sure that we leapfrog those solutions. And how, because in the ecosystem of women, peace and security, you have the policy, and I'm sure we have enough policies. We have the women's organizations, the survivors, all the different actors that need to be at the table. So I think we need to put that community under one platform at national level and make sure that those solutions are at the table, can be studied, can be leapfrogged, and we can share it among one another. So what the continental result framework is doing is that to empower our member states. We have the indicators on the 4 pillars of 1325, and I have indicated that we have included the emerging threat, such as COVID-19. So to identify those root cause of what is happening, we talk about access to schools, we talk about digital, we talk about so many issues, the health system for women. So when we identify such, we can challenges on the ground. So now the solution that are in place, we connect them and we amplify them. I think that is what is, and bringing new stakeholders such as the private sector. So my office is working with member states at national level to own this process, but make sure that it's not just Ministry of Gender, but Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc. Women survivors and women's led organization at the middle of the process, because they should be also the driving force, being the one in the terrain, being the one who understand the communities. And I do agree that financing is one pillar, is a great pillar. But when we talk about the financing, let's look into the budget of our national budgets as well. We should not let it to the donor community alone. We need to ourselves to look at national level, the budget that should be allocated to the women, peace and security agenda, going to the legislative body like the parliament, and making sure that there is an accountability within that budget as well. So I think that mechanism, if we have it, the ecosystem, we will be able to have the accountability process for and look at the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And I couldn't agree more. You're alluding to a comprehensive approach where we all come together with clarity on roles and responsibilities. And then when we have those roles and responsibilities, then the accountabilities, a critically important point. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Morsi, because I know that you wish to add. Yes?
Yes, thank you, Susan. I will move from the policies, the strategies, but I will say one statement that I think the precautionary prerequisites for women in decision-making is becoming a must. At this stage, for conflict or pandemic, we have to have a good representation of women in decision-making positions. They think differently, and this is where we found the solution with our experience in Egypt. If we have women in the decision-making in the cabinet, we think in a different way. So this is one thing. And the burden on women in conflict or in pandemic is extremely psychological. It's not only economical. It's not only losing services. It's losing their children. It's losing their lives. So conflict end up to losing lives, and pandemic also ending up to losing lives. So the psychological burden on women at large in the whole world, and especially in Africa with a number of conflicts around, is extremely problematic. We have to think of a way of calming and giving solution to the women in Africa. The burden is psychological, it's staining their lives for long. So from conflict to pandemic, from pandemic to losing jobs, from losing jobs to thinking of their children's future, is something that would actually move beyond policies, beyond strategies. We have to have an action to calm them down, to give them their rights, and to, beyond all of this, give them the faith that their children would have a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morsi. And I think what you're alluding to here is, again, of fundamental importance, the psychology of the, let's say, I'm just making up a phrase here, the female psychology around the seeking and the evidence, the body of evidence we have around the particular strength in, again, reaching out to people or actors who think differently, again, across lines, across ideologies, across politics. It's a very critical characteristic in today's polarized world. And it's underused, regretfully. So it's a very important point, of course, that you are raising. Thank you for that. I also know that Ms. Mavic is with us, and she would like to also add to the discussion. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I would like to first respond to the first question on how can we build on the visibility of critical issues and inequalities that have been highlighted during this pandemic. First, we need to recognize that this is not just a health crisis. It's a crisis in governance. It's a crisis in leadership. It's an economic crisis. And it's also a crisis in exclusion. And it's a multifaceted problem that requires a multidimensional response. And I also want to emphasize here the exclusion, which in and of itself is a form of violence. And in many countries, women are the majority of the frontline workers and humanitarian responders. And yet, they are not in decision making. They are not even part of the task forces on the pandemic. They are just seen as subjects and recipients, lucky if they are reached by the humanitarian aid, or if they're able to access testing, let alone vaccines. And I've already pointed out there's still a very huge vaccine inequity around the world. And apart from women, people of color, indigenous people, women from minority groups are also excluded from the attention, and more especially in decision making. So, and as Her Excellency Madame Binta Diop has pointed out, we don't have a shortage of policies. There are many good policies. Where is the shortage? The shortage is in the implementation. And we need to reboot, as like in a computer, we need to reboot how we make policies and how we implement policies. Since I have the floor, I beg your indulgence, Madam Moderator, to also respond to one of the points raised on the chat. And how do national action plans speak to local realities? This is a very important question. And this is something that we always emphasize in the global network of women peace builders. To effectively implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda and also the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, they must leave the august halls of the Security Council. They must be taken out of New York, brought to the national level, and brought to the local communities directly affected by conflict. What does it mean? That local women's rights organizations, local authorities, indigenous leaders, paramount chiefs, and every important key actor at the local level must be part of the national action planning, must be part of decision-making over budgetary allocations for this agenda. because local ownership and participation is the only thing that would guarantee effective implementation. If we are not able to reach a woman farmer in Gulu, northern Uganda, or in villages of Cairo, and if we cannot define and if they cannot experience what the Women, Peace and Security agenda mean to them, what difference it makes in their lives, we are failing the promise of this very important agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these extremely helpful insights. And we are running out of time, but there's a question that I think is critically important. I'm going to pose it, and I'll give the word to those of you who can give us an answer in, let's say, 30 seconds. So let's see. Now, how do we incentivize boys and men to be at the forefront and an integral part of working for women empowerment? Who can grasp an answer in 30 seconds?
This is a joint future, Susan. If they are included from now, they are going to have a better future for with their partner, with their children. If they are girls, it's including them at an earlier stage would give them the chance to create for their daughters a better future. If they are excluded, we will have this vicious circle going round and round, and the masculinity issue will come in any decision making or in any policy or in any strategy that we're facing. So include them from the early stage. And when I mean early stage, is really early stage, from very childhood age, from 3-4 years. Talk to them that they are equal with their girlfriends and they are equal with their sisters. Include them early. You will save the whole gender equality and women's empowerment agenda.
Excellent. And on this note, what I take with me, including women, boys and men early, but also, as you said, to highlight that this is really nothing but a public good. It's a win-win for all. Exactly. Dear friends and dear colleagues, this has been an extremely interesting session. And I really would want to thank my panelists for taking their time and sharing their insights with us today. I cannot do you fairness to try to summarize all of these valuable insights. I will just very quickly, in 1 minute, say that Her Excellency Ms. Diop really made a very good point at the early beginning of the session to make the link, the very tangible link between the policies that were quickly committed to by member states in Africa in COVID-19 response, in the early days of the COVID-19 response, and how those must be translated into actions on the ground, also by civil society organizations that are nimble, fast, and can provide service provisions within hours, if not in weeks, if not hours. But also you touched upon the holistic approach, which was a great segue to Dr. Morsi, who actually walked us through the number of policies and programs developed in Egypt from day one, and again, how they were quickly translated into actions on the ground. I particularly appreciate how you referred to what I would say is a simultaneous two-tier approach, which took basically a very in-depth look at the initial effects of the COVID-19, i.e. health, but also violence against women, but also the secondary impact of COVID-19, which is economic empowerment, or how the COVID-19 crisis have impacted women and employment opportunities, and how the government of Egypt worked already from March 2020 on small and medium enterprises, but also social protection. So it's that holistic approach coming again. And Ms. Mavich took us then to some very interesting highlights on the sharp discrepancy between the collective investment in peace and in war. Peace, for example, through women organizations, particularly working on conflict prevention, and war, the financing of arms. Now, you also took us through that the pandemic is a moment and must be used as a moment of reflection. You said that guns will not bring sustainability and peace and stability, but basic social services will. And Ms. Esther, I really want to thank you for concluding the session again by bringing us back to the ground and pointing out what are the exact hinders in terms of women economic empowerment, looking at the root causes, back to the root causes, whether it's education or if it's about, for example, if you want to transition women businesses from the informal sector to the formal sector, is it other issues such as tax or, again, education, information, and digitalization. So again, going back to the root causes to ensure a tailored approach. Dear friends, dear colleagues, a sincere thank you to our panelists. Once again, thank you for your time, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.